Good morning, Zoom folks. Morning. Okie dokie. It's a Friday, so not a lot of people are here. And not just in person, like not that many people are on the Zoom either. That is okay. The more the merrier, and those of you who are here will benefit. All righty. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on our captions. And then, so today the goal is to get through the rest of this lecture pretty quickly. And then there's a little activity at the end that we're going to do related to careers. So, yeah. So we have been talking about like what makes a toxic workplace. And one of the things on the list is sexual harassment. So we're going to spend some more time talking about sexual harassment today. So sexual harassment occurs when employees are subjected to unwelcome sexually oriented behavior. Now, this does not have to be sexual assault. It can be words, it can be expectations, it can be inappropriate touching, it can be demand that you engage in some sort of touching. But overall, there are two basic types. The first is what we typically think of, I think, which is the quid pro quo. It's just the idea that you do something for me, I do something for you. So this would be, you require the person to engage in some sort of sexual act with you in return for job security, promotion, things along those lines. However, probably the more common is the hostile environment. And these are workplaces with unwanted sexual behavior, discussion, or material. So oftentimes this is inappropriate jokes, comments about people's appearance, things along those lines, where it just gets to the point where you kind of don't want to be there because the experience is so miserable. One time when I taught a different class and we talked about sexual harassment, I had our HR person come in and she gave some examples. Nothing that had happened here, just things that she had researched in the state of Virginia. And like, for example, one hostile work environment case had been, female employees were hired on to a shop where like all the male employees in their cubicles had nude calendars. Like that's going to make you feel uncomfortable, right? Another quid pro quo one was they had a kissing club and it was like all the female employees had to kiss the boss. It was very weird. And so, yeah, not okay in either scenario, right? Sexual harassment is unfortunately fairly widespread. About 42% of female workers have reported it. And we know that not every person who's sexually harassed reports it because not every company has good reporting in place for it. So for example, let's say you're at a really small company and there's only one boss. And so there's no HR for you to go to, right? You're probably not going to report it. Consequences of experiencing sexual harassment include anger, reduced self-esteem, depression, anxiety, lowered productivity, and maybe not surprisingly, decreased commitment to the job and to your employer. I mean, why are you going to feel like this is a company you should believe in when this happens, right? So obviously, we don't want this to be happening to people. And one thing I should say is that typically these cases are a female or someone else of a marginalized gender being harassed, like someone who's non-binary or trans, but this can happen to men as well, particularly if it is female people in power, although sometimes if there's male people in power as well. So how do we stop it? So we should promote norms that are intolerant of sexual harassment. So are any of y'all like work study student workers for the college? Doesn't look like, okay, so every single person who works for the university has to do a Title IX training every year. And we think of that as just being related to sexual assault, but sexual harassment is actually part of that. And they take it very seriously. Like one of my adjuncts hadn't done it yet. And I got several emails from my VP like, they have to do this, they have to do this. So, if you make that a norm every year, right? And this year they actually made it better. It used to be, it was like a multiple choice test. And if you got the answer wrong, it didn't matter. And now they actually have like really helpful videos and then a test that you actually have to do well on based on that. Workers should be educated in general about recognizing sexual harassment and what sexual harassment is. I don't know, this might be like a little too old for you guys, but if anyone in here follows the Try Guys and what has happened with them recently. Okay, so if you're not familiar with them, they're 4 dudes who used to work at BuzzFeed. They started their own channel. And one of the guys was just fired, one of the co-owners, because he had a relationship with a subordinate. And a lot of people were like, oh, they can't be a power dynamic. They're both consenting adults. And it's like, how do you not understand that like he owned the company and was her boss and he also was their HR? So like, if it wasn't consensual, there's no way she could have reported it, right? So very problematic. And that situation and reading about that on social media really drew into clarity for me that a lot of people don't understand sexual harassment and power dynamics and things like that. And he's married, and his whole personality is his wife, who I feel the worst about. And this whole thing is she and the kids.
It's so public.
Oh yeah. And like she's gonna feel forced to stay with him, and it's bad. And so like people are like, oh, he got fired because he cheated on his wife. No, he got fired because he put the company in a place where if that coworker that he was having the affair with wanted to, she could have sued them, right? And like taken them for a lot of money. An organization should have policies that expressly forbid harassment, but it's more than that. You also need clearly stated grievance procedures to handle allegations of harassment. So for example, for you all, if you experience any kind of sexual harassment on campus, you can go to the Title IX codes. And in fact, because of the way we can report on this campus, you can go to any employee of the college and we can help you walk through that. And then for workers, we go to HR, and then we would go through similar procedure with them. Another thing that IO psychologists look into, and certainly this relates to what we were just talking about, is stress at work, right? If you're being harassed, you're going to be stressed. So job stress, this can be due to unforeseen, unnatural circumstances, but it also can just be your job is stressful, right? Like for some people, this is intellectual stress. Like I've got to micromanage a whole bunch of things. I got to like multitask. For other people, their jobs are physically dangerous, right? So I think of people who are like linemen for the electric companies. You're climbing electric poles, right? Things along this line. You're in the military, that's your job. Another thing that they look at is role conflict, where you're trying to meet the demands of more than one important role in your life. So being a parent and a worker, or being a student and a worker, right? All of those are going to create tension. And then burnout is something you've probably heard a lot about in the past couple of years. I mean, it's certainly been something for a while, but a lot of people, particularly in the medical field, are talking about burnout right now. And burnout is where you have emotional exhaustion and little motivation for your job. And symptoms of burnout can include confusion, so like hard time concentrating and making rational decisions, worrying all the time, resentment towards your job or other people. Also, it can manifest as physical symptoms. So people get headaches. People will have gastrointestinal issues like ulcers or irritable bowel syndrome. People will have their sleep interrupted, which of course is just going to compound any stress that you're feeling. There are also behavioral things like absenteeism. People just won't show up to work or call in sick more often when they're burned out. Some people will engage in things like drug use in order to get through. And then it can be really impactful emotionally, where instead of being, your normal caring self, you might be cynical, irritable, anxious, right? Which don't necessarily, really for most work environments, that's not going to make you a good worker, right? But particularly I'm thinking of things like the healthcare field, right? You don't necessarily want all your healthcare providers to be irritable and cynical, right? And this can result from chronic work stress or from large events, like let's say a pandemic, or if you are sexually harassed at work, things along those lines. And a lot of times burnout, like, I don't know if you've all ever heard the analogy of like a frog in a pot, right? So if you put a frog, and this is a horrible analogy, like don't do this to a frog, but if you put a frog in a pot of water and you slowly turn up the heat on the stove, the frog won't jump out because it won't really notice the changes. It'll acclimate as it goes until it dies. Again, don't do this to frogs. If you're gonna cook frogs, kill them humanely first. But the same thing can happen to workers, right? Where it's like, well, this is just a little more stress and this is just a little more stress until the point that they realize like, I really can't cope. So how do you manage this job stress? Leisure activities. So, you know, doing things in your spare time that take your mind off work. So for some people, this is stuff like yoga or running. For other people, this is just like sitting and reading a good book, right? Or binging on Netflix. Other people are much more productive and they're like knitting things. And I'm not one of those people. I admire them very much, but it's not me. Vacations. And this is something that like people have constantly pushed more for in the States. In Europe, it's not atypical to have 6 weeks of paid vacation a year when you start a job. Here, you like have to usually accrue your paid vacation days. But we know that getting those weeks off is really important to productivity. Taking care of your body and mind, right? Making sure you get regular checkups, making sure that you are, you know, actually taking time to eat, right? And do silly things like drink water, right? It sounds so silly, but it's not in the long run, right? And then flow. So flow is an idea from existential psychologist Csikszentmihalyi. You don't need to know that name. But the idea is getting in the zone. So flow, the best example a lot of people understand is runner's high. So like when you're in the moment and you're a serious runner, there are times where you don't think about anything else. You're just in that moment. Artists also talk about flow quite a bit when they're painting or creating. But you can get this at work where you're just in the moment. I get this sometimes when I'm writing, like my research papers where, you know, I start writing, I'm just typing, and then I look up and like 3 hours have passed and I have, you know, like 5 more pages. Like, how did that happen? And so this is actually really good to be in flow, like increases happiness, increases productivity, things along those lines. All right, so now we're going to talk about how do you figure out what career you should get. And IO psychologists have tried to help with that as well. So the first model we're going to talk about is Holland's person environment fit model. So not surprisingly, the rationale behind this is how do you as a person, your personality, your skills fit within a certain work environment? So career choice is related to 6 stable personality orientations or personality types for Holland. And in addition, Holland classifies jobs into 6 different types of work environments. And research shows that people are most satisfied with their job, most successful at their job, and most stable, meaning they're going to stay at the same job for longer when they choose work environments that fit their personal orientations. So what are these various orientations? So realistic people are good at mechanical skills, doing stuff with their hands, using sort of technical skills, maybe not so great. I mean, this is weak in social skills. I don't necessarily like to use that word, but yeah, not as strong in social skills. So what type of work environment would they be good in? Things where they can apply those things. So things like farming, being an auto mechanic, engineering. Investigative people enjoy logical analysis, figuring things out, and they prefer ideas over people. So they do really well in research fields and in research libraries as well. Artistic people, maybe not surprisingly, need outlets for emotional expression. And they seek careers in art, music, drama, and even if they can't be the one creating the arts. They might often work in support of those things. So for example, I have a friend who was classically trained as an opera singer. She occasionally will actually perform, but you know, one of her first jobs out of college was she actually worked in the office for the New York Metropolitan Opera, right? Things along those lines. Social people prefer to interact with other people, and they're drawn to what are often called the helping professions. So those are things like teaching, but also a lot of the jobs that you would use a psychology degree for, like being a counselor, therapist, things along those lines. Enterprising people are self-confident and sociable. They have good leadership and persuasive skills, and they excel in sales and management. So these are your people who are going to sell. These might be people who would even start their own businesses, be entrepreneurs. They're the people on Shark Tank, that type of thing. Conventional people are conforming and orderly, and they prefer structured working environments like sort of the day-to-day 9 to 5 in the business world. And again, like, I think the descriptors of these makes this sound negative, but like, if people are fulfilled by that, we need people to do that, and that's not a bad thing, right? So again, that's just one model of career choice. So now we're going to talk about a different one. So Super's developmental model focuses on the development of your occupational status over time. So the idea is you're not just like born into a career, right? You are going to, have to kind of get there through a series of steps. So the first step is the growth stage, and this would take place in childhood. It's where you fantasize about the ideal job, and it might be very unrealistic, right? Like I remember wanting to be an astronaut ballerina. Let's take two of the most selective jobs on the planet and do both, right? Like probably not gonna happen. But as a kid, that's what you're thinking about, right? The exploration stage is where you really start to understand what different careers are and start to consider different careers in your youth. So as I moved forward as a child, I realized like that wasn't realistic. So I thought more about being a veterinarian since I like animals. The establishment stage is where you commit to a career and learn to function effectively. So when I got to college, I realized that being a veterinarian is not what I wanted to do. Instead, what I wanted to do was to be a psychologist. So I committed to that, changed my major to psych, went to grad school. And in grad school, I was still sort of in this exploration / establishment, figured out what I really wanted to do was teach and went from there. The maintenance stage is when you get to midlife. And that's when your focus is on retaining achieved status and protecting any security and power you have. So for people working, again, like the 9 to 5 jobs, this might be about not rocking the boat, right? So we do see trends that people get more conservative over time. And a lot of it has to do with this, right? Okay, I'm in a good position now. I have a good salary. I don't want to rock the boat. I want to just sort of like hang out here. And then the decline stage is at the end of your career. Your work activity decreases as retirement approaches, and sometimes this is literal. So for example, a couple of years ago, Wesleyan established a step-down program for our retirees. And they can do it either over 1 or 2 years. And it's like they gradually teach fewer classes. They no longer have service obligations or publishing expectations, but it's like they can still get their salary and their benefits until they're ready to actually retire. So a lot of companies have something like that. But even if they don't, oftentimes people just don't work quite as hard, which is understandable. They did a lot of the hard work, at the beginning of their careers. So retirement brings the occupational cycle to a close, but certainly does not bring your life cycle to a close, right? Hopefully at that point, you're able to enjoy your retirement. One thing I should also say too, is that some people choose to have a second career after they retire, something that they might find more fun, or will engage in a lot of volunteerism, for example, and so sort of be working, but in giving back to the community. The other thing is, obviously, this doesn't follow the flow of things like folks in the military, right? So if you're not familiar, although I'm guessing a lot of you are, just because of the area we're in, if you're in the military, you can retire after 20 years. So if you enlisted at 18, right, you can retire at 38. So a lot of those folks will then sort of start this cycle again, or at least start again from the establishment stage and work another career. And sometimes they'll just go work like civil service for the same place that they were in the military. So obviously we have a lot of workplace trends about that have changed the nature of work and changed how we do work and how we collaborate. So I think during the pandemic, the role of technology really came into focus of like, this is something that's so important. Technology changes the nature of the work itself. So as we talked about previously, it might be that now there's a machine that does the job of 3 people, right? And you, to keep your job, have to learn how to work that machine. I think about, for those of you who've seen the movie Hidden Figures, which if you haven't, it's fantastic, see it. It happened right up on the peninsula. But the women who used to do the computations for NASA were called computers. And then NASA actually bought a computer, which at that point in time, like would have filled this room. They were huge. And one of the computers, one of the African-American women who was working there, taught herself how to use the new IBM computer so that she had those skills. And it was like, you can't get rid of me because I'm the one who knows how to work it, right? So sometimes that can be really good for you. You have to train and adapt to keep up. And I think, again, during the pandemic, we all had this, right? We all had to learn Zoom and Google Meet and all these other technologies. I've used Google Docs a lot more and Poll Everywhere and things like that, Zoom polls. And so new work attitudes might be required. Workers must take a more active role to prove that they are valuable to get job security. Now, granted, this was before the Great Resignation, which was the word I couldn't think of the other day, which is people realizing during the pandemic, if I'm being treated horribly in my job, I can just resign and find a job somewhere else, right? And so now I think some of this has flipped to where the employers have to have new work attitudes and be paying people a living wage. I know that's shocking. That's like so revolutionary that people should be able to live on their salaries, right? Sorry for the sarcasm. But, you know, so it's on all levels, I think we're getting new work attitudes here. Lifelong learning is becoming more and more of a necessity. So your skills, especially in tech, become obsolete every 10 to 15 years. And again, with the pace of tech, sometimes it's much faster than that. So getting retrained. So just to give you an example. So I graduated from grad school, got quitted with my doctorate in 2010. And I think it was like 2014, I had to go to a week-long STAPS workshop to learn a new skill that had essentially what I'd been taught in grad school was already rendered obsolete. And if I had kept doing the same technique, then I wouldn't have been able to publish. So, and I'm sure in the next 5 years or so, I'll have to do something like that again, because there will be new methods again. Independent workers are increasing. So downsizing and outsourcing, and again, I would say even more so after the pandemic, and people realize I can work from home and I can network with people over Zoom and things along those lines. And more and more people sort of became free agents or consultants, right? And often you can make as much, if not more money, and you're more of your own boss. So that's really something that people genuinely enjoy. The boundaries between work and home are blurring. I'm kind of laughing because, again, I made these slides initially way before the pandemic, and now this is quite literal for a lot of people, right? Where like my home office is it's actually a lovely space. It's like a loft over our great room. So it's like open down to the great room, which means I get a lot of light and air and whatnot. But it also means that like if my daughter's downstairs, you can hear her on the Zoom if I'm meeting with somebody, right? And so you know, literal boundaries between work and home are blurry. I mean, when the pandemic first started, I had students who were like, well, I'm at home with my 3 siblings and my parents are also working from home. And so like, we're trying to work on the Wi-Fi and see if we can all get on, right? And like, this is where I really got into the idea of like, if you need to say something you don't want other people to hear, just type it in the chat, right? To give people some modicum of privacy. And then the highest job growth seems to be occurring in the professional and service occupations. And these, again, these are old, but I would say a lot of these are still definitely the case. So teachers, unfortunately, a lot of teachers got burned out during the pandemic and quit. I know a teacher who had a full-time job and she dropped down to like an assistant because she just could not handle having the classroom by herself, and she's making less money but feeling much more emotionally fulfilled right now. Nurses, we're going to need more nurses because again, the medical professionals are getting burned out. You know, we need sales representatives and people in manufacturing because we need people who can help with the supply chain issues, right? Along those lines, truck drivers, right? So I don't know if anybody ever drives through like Portsmouth, right by where it's like Portsmouth into Suffolk, where there's the port where they get all the basically semi-trailers, right? The container bins off of the ships, and they'll just be stacks of them, right? And those are just waiting for someone with a truck to come get them, right? And deliver them where they need to go. Administrative assistants, accountants and auditors, we always need, managers, carpenters, and I would say other related practical things. So things like general contractors, plumbers, electricians. I have some friends that right before the pandemic, they got an estimate on doing some renovations to their house, and they were just waiting because one of them was getting a bonus at work and they were just going to pay for it with that because they didn't want to have to finance it. And then the pandemic hit and everyone was at home and everyone was like, oh, we should update our house, right? And they couldn't get contractors to call them back because the contractors could pick and choose who they wanted to work with. Automotive technicians and mechanics. And again, this is a field where there's going to have to be a lot of new training as we get, like, if you all just look around when you're on the freeway, I see a lot more Teslas now than I did even like 2 years ago, right? So like people need to know how to service purely electric cars, right? Things along those lines. Software engineers, and I would say even more so people who are able to do like mobile software engineering, right? Apps, things along those lines. Law enforcement, again, medical field, things along those lines. So again, even though it's 10 years later from when this table was made, I would argue these are still the positions that are going to be the growth opportunities. But again, luckily, since a lot of you are thinking of being in the psych field, things that are sort of human resource service oriented are going to be here as well. Unfortunately, we're never going to not need therapists, right? Like we're always going to need people. And unfortunately, the pandemic has created a lot of trauma for people. And so we need to support them. We also know that education is becoming more and more important. So I think for a lot of folks, like my parents' age, probably your grandparents' age, You could get a decent job right out of high school, right, and be making pretty good money. And I think if you go to like tech school now or do stuff, you know, if you have like opportunities for technical classes within high school, you come out with like a plumbing certification, I think you can still do that. And oftentimes like plumbers make more than like I did with my starting salary when I came here with a PhD, right? So we certainly shouldn't be poo-pooing them. But for a lot of jobs that in the past you might be able to get out of high school, now you need at least a bachelor's, right? And so that sort of shifted the work world quite a bit. We also know that our earnings are tied to our level of education. Often when we have more education, we're going to make a higher salary. However, many college graduates are what we call underemployed, where they aren't necessarily using the skills that they got. So underemployment means settling for a job that does not fully utilize one's skills, abilities, and training. And this is most likely if college level skills are poor, particularly reading, writing, and quantitative skills. So this gives you earnings. I want to point out, this is just looking at women and men. If you looked at it by different races, for example, unfortunately, you would see divisions within that as well. And yes, women still make substantially less than men, even with like a master's degree, which is disheartening, but you tend to make more the more education that you have. Again, there's sort of diminishing returns and it depends on your field. Like if I were to be working in an industry setting, I don't know that my PhD would be that much more valuable than a research master's. It would depend on the industry setting, right? So things along those lines. Whereas to have this job full-time, I needed a PhD. Alrighty, so what I have now is a assignment for y'all. And so it's one Google Doc, and I want you all to just all type on the same Google Doc. And this is the same for folks who are on Zoom as well. I'll go ahead and put the link in the chat for y'all. So if you don't want to type in this tiny URL, I posted this on Blackboard under in-class assignments, or if you have the PowerPoint pulled up, you can just, or sorry, the Google Slides pulled up, you can just grab it from there. And so the assignment asks you to talk about your job and essentially how IO psychology would help like the career you're thinking you want to have. So I know not everybody knows fully what you want to be when you grow up at this point in time, but just sort of thinking about, okay, the job that I have, that I'm thinking I want to do, what changes do you think an IO psychologist could make to improve job conditions for workers? And then what management style or overall approach do you think would be typically used in that field and which would be best?
Do you want us to put our name by what we say now?
Nah. Because that way you could feel free to be as open and honest as you choose. And so again, Zoom folks, please also type in yours. I went ahead and put that in the chat, and I am going to go ahead and actually stop sharing for a minute just so everyone doesn't feel like everyone else is watching them typing. So take about 5 minutes or so to do that. And then I'll pull up the form and we can kind of go over some of the examples together.
Styles.
Sure. Go ahead and share screen. And then I can do that. Put it in the slideshow so it's a little bigger for you too. I am. I'm looking at this on my phone, and so I know y'all are actively typing, so I'll give it a couple more minutes. Alrighty, looks like most people have stopped typing, so I'm gonna go ahead and screen share the assignment. And for folks on Zoom, I'm gonna go ahead and enable the lab transcript just in case that's helpful to y'all. Alrighty. Try to zoom this in a little bit. 150. Yep, that'll work. Cool. Alrighty, so types of careers people are looking at: recreation therapist, social worker, nurse, internist, or traveling. Well, I like traveling therapist. Yeah, and that's so much more feasible now. So we're going to start talking about psychological disorders on Monday, and then we finish those, we'll be talking about therapy. But like a lot of therapists now are thinking about staying 100% remote because then they don't have as much cost for overhead. You don't have to pay to rent office space. You don't have to pay all those fees associated with it. Nurse, physical therapist, these are all careers that is going to be growing right now. RN, yep, counselor or therapist, nurse or therapist, child therapist, physical therapist. What changes could an IO psychologist make to the working environment? Making sure the treatment is held in is clean, has good lighting, has proper and updated equipment. Yeah, particularly if you're going to be doing any type of treatment that involves some sort of equipment, right? So physical therapy, rec therapy, even some like psychological therapy, you might be doing what's called biofeedback, where you would hook people up to like skin conductance or something like that. And they watch it on screen and they can actually like learn to reduce their anxiety and their physical reactions. It's really cool therapy. But also like a lot of therapy now is especially for anxiety disorders, is starting to incorporate VR, right? Ensuring that needs are met, that we're just as properly cared for as our patients. Yes, that is so important for doctors, for therapists, right? Properly educated and trained, yeah. Good hospital settings, good academic settings should have a budget for professional development, should bring in speakers so that you can learn from them. And covered in terms of money and traveling expenses, absolutely. Making sure we're in a safe and comfortable environment, yeah. Safe and making sure customers feel safe and comfortable, right? They're going to come back if that's the case. A lot of y'all said safe and comfortable. Those are two really important words, yeah. And what does being a safe environment mean in this day and age, right? We need to be thinking about that. It probably means better ventilation, right? I mean, my hope is that after COVID, ventilation will become a thing the way like clean water became a thing after the cholera epidemic in England. We don't seem to be moving into that direction, but my hope is that it will click for somebody. What managerial style or overall approach you think is typically used and which would be best. Japanese style would be the best approach. It's important that everyone has a strong relationship with one another. Yeah, I think that this is really important, right? You need to be able to collaborate well together on your team to provide the best care possible, whether it's for a customer, a client, a patient, right? And this really is the wave that's been going on in medicine in general, but also in psychology, the idea that like you work on collaborative interdisciplinary teams. So like when I was on my internship, I worked in a whole bunch of different rotations. And like when I was on the health psych rotation, I worked on the spinal cord injury unit. So we would have weekly meetings with the doctors, us, the social workers, the nurses to discuss patient care. The traumatic brain injury unit I worked on actually had a interdisciplinary treatment team that would all work with the patient at once, which was really cool. So the neurologist, the social worker, me as the psychologist, and the psychiatric nurse would all be in the room for the examination and the interview. And then I would take them to a separate room to do like memory tests. And so, yeah, that collaboration is really important. Theory X, because in nursing, you really need to be able to push your students, make sure they're ready. Yeah, we don't want unqualified nurses out there treating people, right? Theory Y, making employees able to take responsibility and work on their own, but have some management to help them solve problems. Something like the transformational leadership style, believes in encouraging employees to focus on maintaining positive energy. It can ensure a higher rate of people enjoying their job. And then that would trickle down to the customers or patients. Yeah. Theory Y again. It allows management employees to work together to solve problems. I think that's really important. Yeah. Somebody else said the Japanese style. When employees and customers have a great relationship, that everything runs smoothly and it doesn't feel like a job anymore. Yeah, I think that that's what a lot of people are aiming for, right? Just to fix their job, not feel like work, right? And the theory Y allows employees to be able to challenge themselves and to be able to give their opinion and outlook on things. It allows employees to be able to communicate in a positive way and work together on any conflict. Very cool. Yeah, that was a great application of the material we just learned. So have a great weekend. And like I said, we're going to start talking about psychological disorders on Monday, which a lot of people find really interesting.